Okay, so I think we're live once again, and I think we're live both on Facebook and on LinkedIn, so that's good. I apologize for the technical difficulties. Let me just make sure that LinkedIn can actually get to this stream, and then we'll get started. But I'm really excited, and thank everyone for showing up. Thanks you all for being here. Yeah, really, really excited. Just give me 2 more shakes, and I'm just going to bring this link into the LinkedIn post so we can get the LinkedIn people as well. Okay, great. So hopefully we get the LinkedIn people in here soon. So thank you so much for coming to my talk on context and storytelling. My name is Rob Ciano. And before we get started, a little about myself. So like I said, my name is Rob Ciano, and I'm a writer, director, and producer living in the New York City area. Some of my main credits include the narrative films 29, which is a coming-of-age rom-com, Shimmer, which is a mystery thriller, and the featured documentary, Real for Us, Fandom, Friendship, and the Boy Who Lived. I also do some editing, some visual effects, and I act now and again. Okay. So the reason that I wanted to have a discussion about context is that basically I think about context a lot. And since it's such a large concept, I'm going to jump right in with a definition. So let me get my, here we go. So context is the circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, or idea, and in terms of which it can be fully understood and assessed. So everything is context. I've created a context for this discussion. I'm sitting here, I'm hopefully looking professional enough, and I introduced myself by talking about some relevant experience that, oh, I don't even have the, talk about being professional, I don't even have the quote up. There we go, context, there we go. Context, the circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, or idea, and in terms of which it can be fully understood and assessed. So, you know, like I said, I'm sitting here, I'm hopefully looking professional enough, and I introduced myself by talking about some relevant experience I have in my field. Sharing the definition of context is itself creating context for this upcoming lecture. It's all very meta. Is everyone following okay? Good. Good. So here is an example of context. So imagine you are going to a stage play. You arrive, you sit down, the house lights dim, and the curtain opens on a castle scene. Okay, immediately you as an audience member are transported to another place where things that wouldn't be believable in your regular life, for example, a knight battling a fire-breathing dragon, are believable. And when the context is set properly, when the context is set properly, it doesn't matter if the dragon is an obvious puppet. Or if the fire is just orange light shining through a smoke machine. The audience will believe in the story, they'll cry for the heroes, and they'll walk away feeling satisfied. Okay? There's actually a term for context, creating context in the theater world, and that's called setting the stage. Okay? So why is context important? Okay? When a storyteller creates a believable context, it allows the audience to relax into the story and get swept up by the experience. Context establishes trust between the storyteller and the audience. And as a result, the audience believes there is a logic to the adventure they're on, whether that's a book, a movie, television show, maybe an online lecture. An understanding of context can even help you just in regular conversation. For example, how many times have you been trying to communicate something to someone, something important, and they're not getting it? Now, sometimes it's a question of creating the right context, okay? Context also prevents the audience from being pulled out of the story as a result of a logic question. So many of us are familiar with the horror movie cliche of like, oh, why did they go down into the basement instead of going outside? And that happens for a reason. That happens because from the audience member's point of view, there's another option as part of the context. The filmmaker hasn't made up a reason why the character can't just go outside, so the audience member can find themselves removed from the story. The character becomes ridiculous because they made a non-believable choice when contextually there were other options. So now if the filmmaker tells us that a character has a fear of the outdoors, or it's below freezing temperatures, or there is more danger outside, they've created a context where that's no longer an option, and the audience remains engaged. Okay, so let's review. The definition of context is the circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, or idea, and in terms of which it can be fully understood and assessed. Okay, so how do you create context? Or more importantly, how do you create context which is believable for your film? Well, the easiest way to do that is to look at the requirements of your story and determine if the setting of your story can shelter those requirements. So what do I mean by that? Okay. Well, one thing you can do is reverse engineer your story. Ask yourself, what do I want to have happen, either at the beginning, the middle, or at the end? And then you figure out what needs to be established in order for those things to be believable. So you can think of it like you're creating your own little world, and the context is like gravity. No matter what fantastical things may happen in your story, everything will still feel grounded and real. Basically, know where you're going and make sure you've packed all the right gear. Now, what does that look like in practice? Let's take a look at my film 29. So I have, let me switch back here. Yeah, there we go. This is my film 29. In the film, the characters see each other across the room while they're on separate dates with other people. There's an attraction, they meet, they start to fall for each other. Of course, there's some force that's driving them apart, but in the end, they find a way to overcome those challenges in order to be together. And it sounds simple enough, right? Well, if the context of the story was going to support all of those things, I had to come up with a setting where both characters would find themselves on opposite sides of the room from one another and determine how they would communicate. So what's the context where two people who don't know each other, each of them on separate dates, end up talking? And of course, they'll be attracted to one another, but what's the conversation they have which confirms that interest? And then I had to determine what forces are driving them apart, what those forces would be. Why are they so insurmountable that they threaten to destroy the relationship? And finally, what new light is shed in a believable way, which enables the characters to finally resolve their problems, and how is it presented? That's a lot. That's a lot. But here's what I came up with for some context, at least for some of those things. So Jeff is getting pressure from his family about setting down some roots and finally purchasing a house. This is established in the very opening scene. There's a voiceover where Jeff and his dad are having a phone conversation back and forth, and his dad's saying, when are you going to get a house? Daly, on the other hand, is struggling to make ends meet. But right after meeting Jeff, she's presented with a huge job opportunity with a big raise, but it's on the other side of the country, which is not only very far from this new guy she just met, Jeff, who she really likes, but is also preventing her from following her true passion, which is acting. So from there, the other elements of the story start to fall into place. So I hope you're starting to see that context as an idea is a little bigger than simply, setting your pirate movie near the ocean or setting your spaceship movie in space. It's also about making sure your characters act in believable ways and that the story beats and elements introduced remain grounded. But then there's the question, what happens if you have elements to your story which doesn't exist in real life? Okay, in this case, you might want to give your story a flux capacitor. So what is a flux capacitor? Well, according to Doc Brown in Back to the Future, it's what makes time travel possible. Of course, right? Right, great. It's a flux capacitor. It makes time travel possible. But how? How does it make time travel possible? The doc tells us that it makes time travel possible. But aside from needing plutonium, electricity, or a fusion device to achieve time travel, we're never told how the flux capacitor actually works. What's in flux? Is it space-time? Is it time? Is it the car? We're never told. We don't know what's fluxing. We don't know what's being, held in capacity. We don't know. It doesn't. The audience doesn't question it though. And why not? Well, because we've met Doc Brown. We've seen his lab full of strange experiments. And most importantly, we've just seen a proof of concept when the car jumps forward 1 minute in time. And then our main character, Marty, accepts Doc's logic. And so does the audience. Time travel is possible somehow thanks to that little device. And because of the context of the story, we believe it. No further clarification needed. How did it work? The flux capacitor. That's how. That's just it. That's how it works. That's what we got. So that's kind of cool. So a flux capacitor. There we go. A flux capacitor in storytelling. It's actually been around a lot longer than Back to the Future. And I guess that's appropriate for a time travel series. The flux capacitor is a great device to use in your stories, especially if you're trying to introduce fantastical elements. But it's great to use anytime the audience needs a jump in logic. So what are some movies that require a jump in logic? I guess maybe if there's a chat there, write them out in the chat and we can kind of review them later. That might be fun to see that if you have any movies that require a jump in logic, and we'll circle back. But one that I was thinking about is actually The Wizard of Oz. So the entire concept of the film revolves around Dorothy being transported from her dreary sepia tone life to a magical land with witches, talking scarecrows, flying monkeys. It's quite the jump in logic for the audience. But the film uses an extraordinary flux capacitor to get us there, which is the tornado that whips through Kansas, ripping Dorothy's entire house off its hinges with her inside it. Okay, that's a flux capacitor. We see incredible things inside the tornado, the things that are still sepia toned, but it shouldn't be possible. So you've got like cows in the tornado and they seem a-okay, and you've got a person scrubbing themselves in the bathtub, and then you finally see Elmira Gulch transforming from a woman on a bicycle into the Wicked Witch of the West. And then when the house finally lands, and this may be the electric bolt to the flux capacitor here, Dorothy literally steps from that dreary sepia tone into the magical, beautiful, colorful land of Oz. And from then on, anything and everything will be believed. How can all of these fantastical things exist? Because Dorothy went over the rainbow by way of tornado, and that's a flux capacitor. Now, the flux capacitor exists to help you achieve those jumps in logic, but they still need to be supported by the context of the story. For example, if Dorothy lived in New York City, a tornado would be much harder to believe. In Kansas, tornadoes are expected. It just so happens this was a special tornado, right? Likewise, we believe that Doc Brown invented a time machine because we know the Doc is an inventor and we saw the stopwatch change. But if the Doc were actually an English teacher, or if there were no demonstration, the audience might have a harder time with that logic. So what are some other examples of flux capacitors? How about these? A spell book. One of my favorite flux capacitors because magic requires huge leaps in logic. But if you have a spell book, it doesn't matter where it came from, who wrote it, or even how those magic words or incantations actually work. The audience will believe it if the context supports it. Oftentimes the context does, because the context is all about, you oftentimes have a magical story going on, or you have a fantasy land where other things like that could happen. The context is supporting the spell book. Meanwhile, a hyperdrive. So if we're dealing with a hyperdrive, we're probably already in a context like science fiction, which allows for some creative license. But hyperdrive is still usually a special technology, even in that setting, and it seems prone to breaking down. Still, it's a device that allows characters to travel extreme distances in very little time, and we as the audience believe it with very little explanation. Just as a thought experiment, if you can think of any other flux capacitors like this, feel free to put them in the chat. It'll be fun to see if anybody has any ideas, and again, we can circle back later on with that. So moving on. Right. So let's get back to context in general, right? So now that we have an understanding of what it is, and we've got a really good tool to use in the flux capacitor, how can a storyteller use context to translate their intention to the audience? Okay. So by creating a context for the story, by creating that little world, the storyteller is able to shape not only the story they're telling, but the audience's reaction to it. They can create meaning from seemingly insignificant things. They can draw on the audience's emotions simply through tiny references, objects, a wink, a phrase which in context carries so much meaning. For example, at the beginning of the movie, The Princess Bride, it's revealed that the in-universe fictional character of Wesley is in love with Buttercup. Of course, as a farmhand, he can't say as much. Still, he does everything she asks, only replying with a simple, "as you wish." The grandfather reading the story to his grandson explains that when Wesley says, "as you wish," he really means, "I love you." At the end of the film, the grandson asks for another story the next night. His grandfather replies, "as you wish," but the viewers know he was actually saying so much more. And that is the power of context. When wielded correctly, context can provide meaning, depth, and richness to an already interesting story. It allows the storyteller to guide the audience member through the world of that story and automatically fill in any gaps before they're even noticed. Okay? Why is it that Rey can use the Force? Turns out she's a Jedi. Well, how does being a Jedi work? It's something about midichlorians and training and meditation. Other than that, do we really know how a Jedi connects to the Force? But in context, do we really need to? Think about that. Now, that's a really great thing about creating the context for your story as well, because it focuses the story, allowing the best elements to shine through. It also allows for fantastic surprises. In the first season of the television show Lost, Locke and Boone are attempting to uncover a strange hatch they found in the ground. And this is on an island in the middle of the ocean. This is, for all intents and purposes, it's deserted. So why is there a hatch in the ground? Anything could be in there, but it won't open no matter what they do until the season finale, when they explode it open with dynamite. When the second season begins, we're seemingly nowhere near the hatch. Desmond is working out, listening to music, punching in a strange code on a computer. It's as if we've been watching, it's as if we haven't been watching the same show. And then there's an explosion, and Desmond grabs a gun and heads toward the entrance to the hatch. He's been inside it the entire time. Now, a twist like that would be out of place if the characters found the hatch the same day it opened, but because the storytellers set the context of the mysterious hatch, which could contain anything, the fact that it's the last thing you expect, it still works, right? And by the way, I've been talking about storytellers and movies and television and theater, but having an understanding of context can help you in your life as well. I used the example earlier that, when you're trying to communicate an idea to someone else and they're not getting it. But if you try the reverse engineering trick and think about the elements you're trying to communicate before you have the conversation, and you can think about all those elements and begin the conversation by laying the groundwork for all those points, you'll be understood. And so now we're nearing the end of the talk portion here. So I'm going to start wrapping up. This is actually part of the reason why I spend so much time thinking about context, because just like the storyteller is trying to create a context in which their story takes place, I feel like every one of us has a context in which we live our lives, go about our day, etc. And we're living out our lives according to the context we have for ourselves, while forgetting that everyone we interact with has a life and context of their own. I think that a lot of times people misunderstand one another, and both because we don't think to consider that someone else may have a different context, and because we don't always explain our own contexts as effectively as we can. That said, I do believe in the power of story, and I believe that an understanding of this concept of context can benefit not only the storyteller, but anyone who wants to understand or be understood. So once more, to wrap up, the definition of context is the circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, or idea, and in terms of which it can be fully understood and assessed. Why is context important in storytelling? It allows the audience to relax into the story and be swept up by the experience. It establishes trust between the storyteller and the audience. It prevents logic questions like, why does that work? Or why did they do that? And what are some ways to create effective context for your story? You can reverse engineer your story by asking what you want to happen. You can create a setting which supports those moments by laying the groundwork early on. And you can utilize flux capacitors to brace against large leaps in logic. So I hope the next time you sit down and start off a once upon a time, or the next time you simply want to make sure that you're heard, remember the power of context and your message will come through. Thank you very much. Looks like we've got just about 30 minutes left. If anybody has any questions or comments, thank you so much for coming and thank you for your time. I hope you all, got some value out of this. Yeah, I had a great time here. So it looks like we have a question here. Another movie might be It's a Wonderful Life with Clarence the Angel. Yes, Clarence is definitely a flux capacitor because, and it's very interesting. The groundwork had to be set very carefully in order for Clarence to be a flux capacitor. He's a guardian angel. So this is It's a Wonderful Life. And for those of you who haven't seen It's a Wonderful Life, it's about a man named George Bailey who is feeling like, I guess the struggle is too much. He doesn't feel like he's making a meaningful contribution to the world, and he is he's really struggling with finding meaning in his life and what he can do. And one of the most famous sequences in the film is when the guardian angel Clarence gives him the opportunity to see what his life looks like or what life would be like in his community had he never been born. It's a really powerful moment, and it is absolutely so here's how the groundwork was set for that. The groundwork was set at the very beginning of the film. We open with essentially angels speaking to one another as constellations in the sky. And they're discussing the life of George Bailey. And they say how one of them, Clarence, will have to go down and help George. So when that scene comes around, it is an incredible and fantastical leap of logic that all of a sudden, George Bailey is no longer alive. It's incredible. How did that happen? How in the world is he no longer alive? But the flux capacitor turns on when when Clarence asks Joseph for the favor, and all of a sudden George's lip is healed and his clothes are dry. The flux capacitor worked, and the audience goes along with the story because all the proof is there. The context has been laid. And it's a very effective scene, and obviously it becomes a very moving experience for George. And this is another example of the context creating something special at the end of the story, because we're told by Clarence that when a bell rings, an angel gets his wings. At the end of the film, of course, there's a bell ringing, and we are as the audience led to believe that indeed Clarence got the wings that he wished for, that he expressed a desire for earlier in the film. So It's a Wonderful Life is a really great example. It has basically all the elements. So thank you for that question. That was great. Stephen, thank you for coming. That's amazing. And I'm very glad to have been able to put this on. Yeah, this is great. I'm not seeing any comments or questions on LinkedIn, but that's a-okay. I guess we can just give it another minute or two if anybody has any ideas. Did anybody come up with some other flux capacitors, or did anybody, what was the other question that I was asking? I was asking another question, but if anybody has any questions about their own stories or their own projects, I'm happy to answer those. In the meantime, I guess I can talk a little bit more about the context of my my first feature film. I'm actually wearing the shirt right now. It's called Shimmer. So Shimmer's an interesting film because we have a creature. We have not just any creature, not a lion, a tiger, bear. This is a creature that doesn't actually exist in real life. This is a light monster. And so we had to really set some interesting groundwork in order to make that believable in the context of the film. The light monster, we had to, I wrote a scene at the beginning where we see the effects of what this creature does without seeing the creature. There's a death very early on in the film, and it's a very strange death. Nobody's ever seen a death like this before, and the characters make sure to talk about how they've never seen a death like this before. When we bring in our character, our main character is an expert in her field. She is a forensic scientist. She has seen death, dismemberment, all kinds of crazy things. And when she's approached with this strange thing, we believe her when she says this seems like something a human couldn't do. This seems like it has to be something else than what we're aware of. That one statement, that one idea carries the audience with the character into the movie. And eventually we do get a reveal and we see the creature, and it is a light monster. It's literally just a being made of light. But the audience believes it because everything that's led up to this point has slowly but surely introduced us to the idea that this is a concept that is real, it can happen, and here it is. You know, it worked in the film, and I'm you know, I'm hoping people are going to go watch it. That's great. If there's any other questions or comments, we can hang out for another minute or two. What are some other great movies that require some leaps in logic? Let's go with Star Wars, because Star Wars has a really interesting concept setting technique, which is the opening crawl. A lot of movies will open up with, you know, or stories open up with Once Upon a Time. And Star Wars does this when it tells you what the episode number is, and it gives you the groundwork for what's leading up to the events of the film. For example, you know, rebel leaders striking at the Empire from a hidden base. That tells you a lot if you're paying attention to the opening crawl. You have no questions as to why there are tensions between these peoples, between these planets, between this empire and these rebels. You understand it immediately because there's this device that's used, which is the opening crawl. But that's not the only point in Star Wars when foundation and context is addressed. It's addressed at all times. There's an incredible leap in logic where we're already dealing with a fantastical setting with spaceships and blasters and fun stuff, right? But there's an element called the Force that surrounds us. It penetrates, binds the universe together. How exactly is an audience member meant to connect to that? How is an audience member meant to understand that? Because that's a little ethereal. That's a little esoteric. What they do in Star Wars is they give you little bite-sized elements of it. Obi-Wan talks a little bit about the Jedi and talks a little bit about how Luke's father was an honorable person. Then later when they're on the Millennium Falcon, he encourages Luke to reach out with his senses when he closes the blast shield and he's using the remote. And surprise, surprise, Luke's able to do it. So all of a sudden, there is something to this strange esoteric idea that we've just been introduced to. There is something to that, although we don't know exactly what it is. Of course, that comes into, comes into play in a major way in the climax when Luke uses the Force to guide the missile into the exhaust port, blowing up the Death Star. Now, if we hadn't spent the whole movie learning about what the Force is, what its potential could be, what its limitations might be, if Luke all of a sudden just willed that torpedo into the exhaust port, it wouldn't be believable. The context was laid successfully, and then we have an incredible sequence. So, yeah, that is Star Wars, and I guess that's about. Oh, here we go. What about stories with multiple flux capacitors, like Doctor Who? So I was reading about flux capacitors before, completing this talk, and actually the TARDIS itself is a flux capacitor. There is so much about the flux capacitor that we just don't, about the TARDIS that we don't understand. We know that it moves through time. We have, so for those of you who don't know, this is Doctor Who, which is, it's the longest running sci-fi series in history. It's been running since 1963, continuously, the same storyline since 1963. It's really cool. And there is a time machine in it. It travels through time and space called the TARDIS. Stands for time and relative dimension in space. So it's a box that is bigger on the inside. It contains universes. It contains so much that the audience needs to wrap their mind around. So the TARDIS itself is used as a flux capacitor to get to different stories in the Doctor Who universe. But there's actually a flux capacitor that's used to understand the TARDIS. And this might be what this commenter was talking about. The multiple flux capacitors. So this is a flux capacitor within a flux capacitor. The first thing that happens when a new person enters this device, it's the size, it's maybe 5 feet by 5 feet by 12 feet tall. It's not a very big thing, but on the inside, it is enormous. It's bigger on the inside, and that's the first thing that happens when people approach the TARDIS, is they say, oh my gosh, it's bigger on the inside. And the concept of something small being bigger on the inside helps the audience take that leap in logic. So then when you're inside the device and you travel from 2005 London to the end of the universe or the end of planet Earth, it's not as great of a leap in logic as it would be if you didn't have that device. There are so many, Doctor Who is flux capacitors within flux capacitors on top of flux capacitors sometimes. So that is, that it might be worth it having a talk just on Doctor Who and how they handle all that to begin with. To be honest, that might be a lot of fun. But that is, it's actually common if we're going to use a sort of wider definition of a flux capacitor, that, I think a lot of stories use multiple devices. And I think that's okay. I don't think it makes anything lazy about your story. I think that as a storyteller, it's keeping you focused in your story. Let's see, here's another comment. It seems that the writer, filmmaker, creator has both a cool opportunity as well as an important responsibility when creating context, the ability to take an audience on a wild adventure, evoke deep emotion, inspire hope, etc. And that's extremely true. It is a responsibility, because so there's a movie that I watched recently. It came out a number of years ago, Scott Pilgrim versus the World. In Scott Pilgrim versus the World, it's basically a comic book as a movie. There are fantastical elements that, the film takes place in our world. It doesn't take place on another planet. It doesn't take place in a fantasy setting. It takes place ostensibly in our world. But the context is such that in one scene, Ramona Flowers pulls a 15-foot cartoon hammer out of her very tiny handbag. And that wouldn't work if the filmmakers didn't take their responsibility to set the groundwork for the film properly. It wouldn't work if they hadn't done that properly. But what's happened up to that point in the film is we've slowly been ramping up the intensity and the craziness and the wackiness and what these characters are able to do. And so when it comes to a large object coming out of a very tiny bag, like Mary Poppins or something, it's believable because the directors took their responsibility seriously. If they hadn't laid that groundwork, if the movie had been completely normal, and it's a there's fight scenes and stuff. So if they hadn't been doing those, if they had been doing those fight scenes without that buildup all along, if it had just been punches and kicks and not special effects and different things, and Ramona pulls out this giant hammer, the audience would have a much more difficult time with that sequence. That's a great movie. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. That's a really fun one. Well, I guess, yeah, let me see if I have anything going on LinkedIn, if there are any comments over here. I know that there was some issues getting people to the LinkedIn, so I'm hoping that people were able to navigate over there. But once again, thank everybody for showing up. I am very passionate about film and storytelling, and I would like to do more talks about film and storytelling. So in addition to thoughts about flux capacitors or setting context or anything like that, if you have any ideas or if you have any questions that you'd like to be discussed in greater length, I was really thinking about doing a talk on the relationship between the director and the actor, because the director has a lot that they are paying attention to, and so does the actor. And I think that if the two of them were able to understand each other's contexts a little more, you can get some really great performances and some really great films. So if you have any other topics that you'd like to see explored further, I would love to hear what they are. Any movies I'd recommend for people getting into storytelling. There are so many incredible films out there. And it really depends on what you are interested. If you want to get into storytelling, the kind of films you should look for are the kind of films that are evocative of the story you'd like to tell, or have elements that you'd like to introduce into your stories. Some general films, however, a couple of the classics, Citizen Kane, widely described as one of the most impactful films of all time, thoughtful films. Books and documentaries have been created about that film. So Citizen Kane for sure. The Wizard of Oz was groundbreaking in some of its techniques and its storytelling. As you can see, we have a flux capacitor in that story. I think it's a great idea to also try and find some indie film or some less or some film that, especially if you want to get into storytelling, look at how stories are told without words, or in some older films that are silent films. If you're into kind of scary or creepy movies, something like Nosferatu, that's not a long movie, but it's very effective in how it creates that kind of creepy sensation, and the vampire and all of that. It's a Wonderful Life, excellent movie. The Back to the Future movies we talked about a lot because they're great movies. I think one of a great movie to watch is the first Godfather movie, and of course the second Godfather movie. But The Godfather is probably one of the best movies ever made in terms of storytelling, the way elements are put together, and how information is revealed, and how the characters change, and why the characters change. It's all about context. The Godfather, it's almost as if the point of The Godfather is Michael Corleone at the beginning of the movie is meant to be the golden boy. He's not supposed to be part of the family business. He's not supposed to be part of what the family does, but the context of the family forces him into the role to where he cannot escape it. That's a great movie to watch if you're getting interested in getting into storytelling. I feel like I'm just talking about a bunch of very obvious movies. Star Wars, excellent storytelling. E.T. is a great example of storytelling, and very subtle storytelling as well. There are things that are done in E.T. which are not laid out bare in front of you. They happen and you understand them because of the way the film is told. Another, and I guess I'll give one more just as sort of a little more esoteric offering, which is Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And the reason that I share that one in the context of this conversation is because I feel like it actually is a great example of using context in a really creative way. The concept of Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind involves Jim Carrey's character and Kate Winslet's character. They have been in a relationship and they've broken up. And Jim Carrey's character learns that Kate Winslet went to had a service erase all of the memories from her mind of their relationship. There's a few leaps in logic that need to happen in order for the audience to be on board with this concept. But Joel, played by Jim Carrey, ends up attempting the same procedure. And because of the context of the film, the filmmaker, Michel Gondry, is able to create a very beautiful story. He plays with the context. Once a filmmaker or storyteller knows that their context is concrete, they have the ability to play with it, do different things, create surprises, create, things that you aren't, like the hatch in Lost. We spend the whole season building up that they're digging something up. What's it going to be? What's it going to be? When season 2 opens up, it seems as if we're nowhere near the island, but all of a sudden, all of that context comes crashing down on us with that explosion. It's incredible. I'd really recommend watching everything you possibly can, to be honest, because it's also great to see when you think you can do better. If you're a storyteller, and I don't mean this in sort of an arrogant kind of a way, but if you're a storyteller and you're watching a movie and you say, man, that's an interesting ending. I wonder what would have happened if, that's what gets the creative juices flowing, and that's what gets story flowing. That's what creates, that's what creates the beginnings of story, is asking, I wonder, or what if, or how would this happen? Or I wonder what that kind of person is like. But yeah, I mean, I like I said, Citizen Kane, excellent film. It's a Wonderful Life, The Wizard of Oz, The Godfather. Oh my gosh, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, Star Wars, E.T., so many great films for storytelling. Another one of my favorite films, which involves, a lot of context, is Hook. Hook, I feel like, exemplifies some really excellent storytelling. The story of Peter Banning realizing that he might be Peter Pan, and that he is Peter Pan, and that he has to then save his children. Though an audience member might be going into that movie with an understanding of the story of Peter Pan, the movie is created and designed in such a way that you don't need to know who Peter Pan is to watch the movie. You can understand every second of that film, even if you've never watched or read Peter Pan. So I think that's another great film that I recommend watching, is Hook. So yeah, I guess I'll wrap it up now. We're coming into the last couple of minutes, and once again, everybody who came to this talk, thank you so much. This was my first lecture, and I think that it went very well once we got those technical difficulties taken care of. I really appreciate all of your time. Please share this video if you think you know someone who might find a discussion about context interesting, and join me next time. I will definitely be having another lecture, hopefully very soon. Like I said, it might be on the topic of the relationship between the director and the actor. We'll see. I definitely am interested in that topic. But if there is a topic that you as an audience member are interested in, please do not hesitate to put it in the chat, to reach out to me directly. And also, please check out my feature films. And the first one is Shimmer. The second one is called 29. And I also have a featured documentary about Harry Potter fans called Real for Us, Fandom, Friendship, and the Boy Who Lived. All 3 of these can be found links from my website, which is robciano.com. That's C-I-A-N-O. And you can also follow me at Rob Ciano Film on Facebook, on Instagram, on X, I guess, although I don't think I've ever posted. I don't know if I've posted on X very much. And again, thank you so much. Appreciate your time.